Great. Welcome to the session on delivering impact through ESG data. I'm delighted to welcome our panel today, Marlene Oberheide, who's the ESG Solutions Engineer at OneTrust, Andrea Vena, Chief Climate and Sustainability Officer for the European Space Agency, Amir Sokolovsky, Global Director for Climate Change at the CDP, and online we have Shiva Rajgopal, who's the Kester and Bimes Professor of Accounting at the Columbia Business School. So welcome to this session. Before we get started, I'm interested in who is collecting ESG data at the moment. If you could just put your hands up. Okay, who thinks they've totally nailed it? Because I'm going to hunt you down afterwards, and I might have to have a conversation. And who's using it and feels that they're having impact with ESG data in their organization? Yeah, okay, great. It's been at the center of a lot of controversy, although it's, ESG has been one of the hottest trends, but we're in the wake of a big controversy on the use of data. There's quite a big backlash on ESG data. President Biden has just exercised his presidential veto to allow some pension funds to take ESG factors into account. But what we want to talk today about is how we can deliver impact through ESG data. How can you improve the way you're collecting the data? How can you forecast and see risks and actually improve the way that you're collecting and using that data? But I'd like to get the ESG controversy out of the way before we get into this and start with that question. I mean, what's your view on it? Is the controversy about the use of ESG data, the value of ESG data justified? Amir, do you have a view on that?
I feel pinpointed. It's a normal political backlash against any change. I see it significantly stronger in the US, where I see it actually as a branch of a political tribal war. ESG data is quite often associated with scientific facts that are usually more objective than many of the social elements on which we create legislation. So I think with time, when those interests subside and realize that they're not partisan, that this will also subside. That is my faith. But I do believe, and then I'll pass the thing, litigation will happen. It has to. And that litigation will bring out reasonableness, what it means to have fiduciary duty in an extended context, and how this data is actually not, use the term earlier of woke capitalism, is not an element of that, but rather an element of survival, and quite crucial to any business planning. I'll stop there.
And Shiva, I'd be interested in your views, because as you are a financial accounting professor, I'm sure you've probably got quite strong views on the use of ESG data and the greenwashing controversy.
Yeah, how much time do you have?
Keep it brief. Keep it brief.
Let me try and, I might be token American on the panel, maybe, so I guess it falls on me to defend this. So let me step back a little bit and just lay out why I think this is an important movement. And I started as a cynic about the whole idea. And as I thought a little harder and deeper, two things occurred to me. One, if you look at the income statements of modern companies, we set the cost of natural capital they use to zero. Now, I don't know how to value natural capital, but it is not zero. So that's statement number one. Statement number two, the reporting system also does a fairly horrible job, in my view, of measuring and reporting externalities, both positive and negative, to be fair. The negative stuff has received a lot of press, emissions and so on. But let's not forget R&D. A company probably keeps 5% of the value that it releases to the ecosystem. So in both those, and these are revolutionary ideas. So the political backlash, etc., is almost expected. As Amir said, litigation is expected. It's going to be a long change. Final point here: a lot of the intellectual claims on which this woke capitalism pushback rests on, it's quicksand. There's nothing there. So I've looked quite extensively. I'll give you one example. So the list that the Texas AG put out, banning funds. I'm sure you're aware of this, right? If you go and compare that list of funds to what the top 10 Texan state pension funds actually hold, There's minimal overlap. You see what's going on? It's like saying, these 4 people are banned from my building, except they never come anyway. So, and there's there's a lot going on. So people don't unpack the headlines. And the last point, I'm amazed that some esoteric investing style, such as ESG, has become such a contentious issue. But since it is hard to define, as I think Amir said, it's become a political piñata. Everything you hate about the world is because of ESG. And you can just fill in the blanks, and it's become a rallying point. Now, the greenwashing issue that you raised, I think it's rampant, and we need some creative out-of-the-box solutions. Regulations are fine, but we need some, say, grassroots level enforcement, something like a Yelp. I don't know whether you guys have a Yelp in the UK for greenwashing. Maybe some NGO can pay a bounty hunter a little bit of money, and maybe the regulator can share some portion of the penalties that they charge if bounty hunters come back and tell us about greenwashing. So something different needs to be done along those dimensions. Rules are not going to get us very far.
Good. Well, some extreme measures, some sensible measures, not sure about the bounty hunters. And I hope with the quicksand, you don't mean we're all sinking in and we're never going to come out. But let's dig in. So how can we, what data are companies collecting? What is material? It covers so many different things. I mean, if I think about the data that we need to report, it's hugely broad. So what is material? What really matters?
Yeah.
Marlene?
Very good question. I think the biggest complexity in this as well for organizations is to figure out what is relevant for me, what is relevant within my industry, right? We have frameworks, we have certain regulations, but it's all very broad. And loads of organizations really struggle to break it down and say, what is meaningful for us? What is meaningful to our stakeholders, to our employees? What is the data we should really be collecting and looking at? And how do we use that data? And I think that is actually a big difficulty. And maybe coming back to the point about regulation, legislation, etc. I think it is important to have certain rules in place to give a bit of a guidance as well, because a few people raised their hand and said they are feeling like they're making impact and they're collecting the right data. But it was only really few hands out of the audience we have. And I think it shows that organizations still struggle to understand what they should be collecting, how to then read that data, what to make out of data, how to use this to drive impact in the organization. And I think that's a big issue that still exists that needs to be addressed when it comes to ESG data.
And from your perspective, Andrea, you're the practitioner, so you are collecting, you're reporting this data, whether that's actively being collected by organizations like the CDP, or it's being passively collected about your organization. Where are the pain points? And would you agree with what Marlene has just said?
Well, space sector is quite a peculiar one, let's say. So we are not like a mass producer sector where we have plenty of millions of types of products. Satellites require a long time of research and development, 10 years, 15 years sometimes, and they are produced in few units. If you take apart the mega constellations that are coming up now, satellites are very peculiar. So we cannot work in the normal way with our suppliers. We cannot say just collecting data, it's our duty, it's our job. We have to work hand in hand with them. Cooperation is very important. We have to understand and to get the knowledge base for the specific products that we are producing, enriching this knowledge base. And it is requiring a long time because the life cycle of a spacecraft is a very long period. And we cannot do it in shorter time than it is taking place. So we are in the making, and as an intergovernmental organization, ESA is driving these kind of things, and I can promise you that we have the commitment and the engagement of our companies that are working with us on this subject.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the mind boggles. We produce newspapers, completely different ballgame. But why does it make sense to collect this data in the first place? You go through a huge amount of effort. Of course, we have disclosures coming in now. They were mandatory in the EU. Amir, what's your view on the benefits? I mean, why are we doing it? Why can you drive impact with this data?
Before I answer that very serious question, I'm going to mention that we said the life of spacecrafts is really long, and bounty hunters for greenwashing are my two favorite sentences. I think I'll start by breaking down a dichotomy that exists in our mind and shouldn't, which is that there's a difference between collecting ESG data and any other financially important and viable data. It's just business planning. It's what it is. As humanity advances and changes the uses of the world and its understanding of the world, it understands also what damages it, what changes it, and what direction it wishes to go. Those things then create laws and regulations, preferences, whether they're mandatory or voluntary. And that data, definitely in the last 3-4 years, but arguably should have been in the last 25 years, if not longer, is becoming an absolute base minimum. To go from the abstract to the factual, France in 2016 was the first country to regulate around conditions for disclosure around holding of fossil fuels. 5, 6 years later, about 40% different in the value of those that hold and those that do not. So factually speaking, society has internalized to an extent and will continue to do so. The science is getting sharper on a day-to-day basis, and the impacts are also getting clearer to us on a day-to-day basis. It's not a question of, it often is as well, of profit. It's now a question of survival. If you as a company have not taken these things into account, you will not survive because cost of capital will be higher, because your assets will be deleted, or for many other reasons, is the first answer, and I'm sure there are many more to go.
And Shiva, I'd like to pick your brains on this too. I mean, how far are you seeing organizations merging their ESG data with financial accounting data? How is it being leveraged, and what are the barriers to effectively using ESG data from your perspective?
You know, my view is that there's a long way to go. You know, we almost need ESG bookkeepers, people who actually sit and, you know, count how much cash came in and out. Those are the bookkeepers. Now that's done by machines. You need a version of that for ESG. For instance, you know, in the US, barely 30% of companies voluntarily report scope 1, sometimes scope 2, very little of scope 3 gets done. Somebody has to actually go, first of all, collect all that data. And that extends to S, you know, the human capital issues. Measurement is, in my view, quite bad. There's another philosophical and deeper problem here. Look at Tesla's impact report. I haven't checked, but you know, when I checked maybe 2 or 3 weeks back, they had an impact report for 2021 out on their website. This is what, March 2023. They've had 3 or 4 or 5 quarterly releases. So that tells you the problem. So these two silos don't talk to one another. You know, so unless the silos talk to one another, by which I mean the financial reporting organization, which is buttoned down, accountants, you know, internal control systems, they worry about segregation of duties, audit trails, accuracy, and then you have the other leg, which, you know, they're nice people, but they're not necessarily trained in the language of finance or law or economics. And they have a hard time communicating with this other side. So unless these two silos, you know, meet somewhere, it's very hard to have real impact. You collect a bunch of, you know, non-financial indicators here, and then people will keep wondering what might the cash flow dollar impact be, which at least for the Republicans is probably the central problem with this whole issue. So we need to accelerate how these two silos talk to one another. We need cultural translators. We need somebody who can bridge these silos.
Just coming back to the CDP perspective again, because I'm quite interested here in what you're saying, Shiva. I mean, surely this data is being used to access capital, to receive access more effective capital, to look at incentivization when, say, a plant's been built that you get if you achieve your goals. I mean, are the departments not speaking together? There's the financial accounting here, and then do they not need to work together? I mean, that kind of baffles me.
So the question, sorry to clarify, the question is between the state and the non-state actors. Is that the?
No, within an organization.
Within an organization, communications. CDP currently has disclosure of close to 19,000 organizations, another 1,100 cities, states, and regions, more than 50% of global capital marketization, yes. And the amount of times where legal doesn't speak to sustainability, that doesn't speak to the CSO, is staggering.
Okay.
And that comes, one of the outputs of that lack of communication is quite often litigation. So if we put something out completely innocuously as a sustainability report that hasn't gone through a CSO or that hasn't gone through, then there's a problem. Do they communicate with each other increasingly now? I'd say yes. the difference between the SEC, for example, and the ESRS, I'm going to generalize now, I apologize, this is not a scientific point of view, but quite often legislation in the United States is low ambition, but you do it. As in, there is enforcement, you do it, you'll be caught. Legislation in Europe is quite high ambition, but it'll start in 2026 and apply to every third company on the third Tuesday of every week. And then build up significantly higher.
Sounds like we need the bounty hunters here as well.
Yeah, somewhere in the middle. I feel that the SEC is forcing a lot of these discussions to go where they are in more European countries, to go across the companies in general.
I mean, Andrea, would you agree with that from your perspective? Is there a challenge in communicating across the organisation?
Absolutely, yes. For my experience and the experience in my organization and the companies that are working for my organization, so our supplier, this is pretty clear. There is a lot of ambition. This ambition is often very high in the company or in the organization, but then this has to be poured down in the organization and in the different companies, and it is not always easy. There are multiple parameters that are governing this kind of activities. So communication is one of them, but it is not the only one, I would say.
Yeah.
But I totally agree.
I am collecting questions in Slido, and I've made it really large so I can read it without my reading glasses. So if you do have questions, do post them as we go along. I think, Marlene, on this point, what are you seeing on the technology side? Or, is it quite a mixed batch or mixed quality of data that's coming in? Because you must look at this and analyse the quality of data that's coming in.
Yes, yeah, and coming back to what you just said earlier as well, right? Departments don't talk, and this is exactly what we see, or what I see in my daily work. Different parts of the organisation don't communicate, and everyone tries to solve these issues themselves, right? Every department has their own mechanism of collecting data. Loads of departments need different data points, and they all keep running out. Like, some have got little Word documents and do interviews, others send out emails, others send out Excel spreadsheets, and then you just end up with so many different pools where your data sits, and no one really has the same level of maturity within the organisation, and that then is reflected in the data quality. And then we come back to the point of, right, political debates about questioning ESG data in general and questioning the quality, and I somehow see the point, because yes, some organisations just run around like headless chickens trying to collect some sort of data because someone said, oh, you need to know these things, without really understanding what does this mean and really understanding how can we do this effectively.
Yeah.
And this is, right, technology can be such a powerful enabler because it can also free up people's time. Rather than having employees spend hours and hours of running around doing these interviews, asking HR, oh, how many interviews did you conduct, how many people did you hire? You can just pull all of this out of existing systems, right? You can just free up people's time. You can run analysis in the background automatically, and then you can suddenly use the data that is way more accurate to drive impact in the organisation rather than wasting time collecting it.
So what you're saying is the data should technically all be there already and easy to access?
I think big chunks of it, yes, definitely. And I think that's another mistake organisations do, is always trying to create these things from scratch, trying to find this information from scratch, because departments don't speak to each other. No one knows who holds what data already. And then we just repeat and repeat and repeat when we can just reuse instead.
So how can disclosures and regulation, I suppose, help companies build a foundation for their data, help them prepare for this? Shiva.
Okay, I'll give you an example from history. So for the longest time, remember the big three car makers? They would make pension promises, but they would never book them on an anticipated, what's called an accrual basis. They would just book cash. So I make a promise to pay you a pension 20 years from now. Just go back to work. The CEO has gone in 3 years, right? That was the story of Detroit. And what fixed that problem was an accounting rule which said that you had to anticipate all the pension payments that you're going to make in the next how many ever years and book them now. And guess what happened? A whole bunch of these pension and healthcare plans disappeared. So accounting rules do have fairly serious consequences, and that can be good and that can be bad. So in this example, I think Ahmed mentioned that, and some of the other panelists mentioned this as well. Just the anticipation of an SEC rule is making people think about this, which can't be a bad thing. And so rules have consequences, and I love Ahmed's statement about low ambition and high enforcement. I'll take that any day, the alternative. But it just the anticipation of the rule And I'm happy to amplify if you want.
So let's talk a little bit as well about technology and how that can help organizations analyze or see their data, because I think what's interesting is how they're actually able to deliver the impact. I mean, what output is all of this data actually giving people? I mean, what do they see that they can actively use?
Yeah,
Marlene?
I think it's just coming back on sort of how can we use this and how can we use technology. I think one big factor for me is real-time insights, right? The example that we had earlier of the Tesla report, it's still not out. We don't have any visibility, right? If you use technology, you can get real-time insights. I log in the morning, I look at my dashboard, I can see, okay, how have my KPIs changed overnight, for example, and that gives me way more leverage as the ESG professional in the organisation to take action, to drive action in the organisation, and to communicate back to my board, rather than again having to go through lengthy exercises of collecting, analysing, reporting. Right, everything just takes forever, and we need to be fast. We don't have that much time anymore. So I think for me it's really about this real-time insights and getting valuable insights, right? Not just meaningless data, but something that really matters for my organisation, and getting that real-time insight, I think.
And what does collecting the data from the ground up actually help organizations do?
People are quite obsessed with CDP scores, and I want it on record that I think that they're important, but actually CDP started as a learning journey. And in the collection of the data, much like in studying for an exam that we all hate, ultimately you certainly remember from the notes that you make. There's a wonderful stat, which is one of the very few that I remember because I have no room for a notebook here, I'm not complaining, is that 75% of companies that report to CDP in their first year score a D, and in their third year score a B. Our scores criteria go up every year. It's not that we made it better, it's not when we take no money other than administrative fees from companies, it's that they have learned what is required to disclose. And as a sort of bridge to the previous question, if I may, one of the biggest challenges that corporations are going to have is multi-jurisdictional work. How do you take the conditions from the SEC, compare them to what the ISSB is requiring, and there is, CDP has declared that it will incorporate and help create the ISSB, and then we'll build up on that in a best practice sort of world. But there's always going to be a small element where things are actually contrasting to each other. The best way that we use in terms of technology, there are a few ways that CDP at least uses technologies in terms of collection of data, is adopting an XBRL platform that will fit into all of those, and CDP will be doing the same. And it cannot be overstated. There's a stage in which something is a thing, that crazy people wanted to save the spotted owl, and then it becomes a bit more of a thing, and then it becomes a piece of voluntary standards, and then it becomes, oh my God, we should actually know that because I never knew I had to do that, and then it becomes a piece of legislation, and people forget the next step. Legislation is a soft mold that isn't full of interpretation, and there's other legislation that will impact it. And that is the place where confusion is created, and that's the place where technology and continuity, I would say, obviously CDP tries to integrate all of them, but continuity and understanding what the highest principles are. It's very much the way we function. I'll stop because I see the time ticking, sorry.
We talked earlier about how to verify and check the data and make sure what you are using is correct. And I'm fascinated by the ESA role with using satellite data. On the one hand, companies are collecting their data, they're inputting their data, or it's being sourced from annual reports. But how can satellite data be used to verify industry or regional emissions? Do you see, moving forward, a role for satellites to play in helping improve the accuracy of ESG data? Or e-data?
This is a very good question, and would require a lot of time, because the big advantage of satellites is that they provide you a global vision. So not only ESG or environmental data that are relevant to the emissions, but also to the entire biosphere. So you can have information about the thickness of ices, you have information about the biomass of a forest in the tropical countries, so all the elements that are in a way contributing to the health of our planet. As far as what you were saying, how satellites can be used for sort of a double check for sure there is a huge potential for, let's say, act against greenwashing in that sense. Because satellites already today can provide a lot of variables and measurement of actual emissions for different greenhouse gases. Among them, there is methane, for instance, that, as you know, is the second one to contribute to the global warming, and has a big advantage, methane, because it is lasting few years in the atmosphere. So if we stop finally to produce this 60% of anthropogenic methane, we can dramatically reduce the effect of global warming. And there will be other satellites in orbit, and I'm talking only about the satellites that are produced by ESA, but there are plenty of satellites all around the world. There are many private companies and public companies producing satellites that provide a lot of data and information. The main challenge is to translate those data into active services that can be provided either to states to verify that there is no greenwashing, or to individual companies that may want to understand whether what they have evaluated through the collection of their data is coherent and is consistent.
And that's where I'm quite interested in this comparison, so the benchmarking, either between industries, which would be with satellite data, but between companies as well, because if we collect our ESG data and a company similar to us is collecting their data, what can I actually draw from that so that I can have an impact or see what others are perhaps doing that we could do differently? I mean, how is data being used in that way? I mean, CDP does some industry benchmarking, I believe.
We work with the World Benchmarking Alliance, and we do de facto a lot of the benchmarking is in accordance with our questionnaire and the guidance on how to score, which is, again, supposed to be a learning journey. But CDP's verification of data has two faces. It's the social face, well, three, the financial face, and in terms of scientific or legal face, to date, we have requested a verification of 70% of your scope 1 and 2. From this year, it'll be 100% or near to, because it's impossible to verify 100%, so I think it's about 98. And scope 3 comes back to the question of how would you define, and this is a challenge we discussed before, it's very, very hard to track in a fair way, in a comparative way, but I remember saying that about other scopes 5 years ago, and now everyone's like, oh no, I do that in my sleep, it's not a problem. So I have faith that that too will be solved. Other levels of verification, and we always say that CDP is one of a huge ecosystem of data, and access to it by whether it's civil society or whether it's investors themselves who request it creates a verification of that. And increasingly now law will as well create a certain verification. We are not compliance creators or assurers, but it is impossible to think that you're alone in the ecosystem. We have to behave as if we understand that civil society is looking, academia is looking, consultants are looking. So.
And I'm interested, coming to this topic about impact, can you share examples where you've seen organizations are effectively able to leverage their data to do something that's had an impact, a financial impact, a material impact in the organization? Are there examples? I mean, Shiva, I'm sure you probably look at a lot of different case studies. Are there examples that you've come across where it's been effectively leveraged?
So, I'm going to say something that's probably shouldn't be mentioned in a sustainability conference. It's the role of a tobacco company. So one of the best case studies I've come across is Philip Morris, PMI. Go look at their sustainability report. I've written a piece a while back saying this is what the oil company should be looking at. So unless sustainability is ingrained in your strategic thinking, and unless you have a mindset of accepting challenge as opposed to being defensive, which is just a small summary of what PMI does, it's hard to have, it's hard to make a lot of progress. So I'd encourage, folks in the audience to go look at PMI's sustainability report and learn from that, regardless of your views about tobacco.
I'll keep my views to myself on that topic, having 2 small children. Amira, have you come across interesting examples in your experience?
Actually, a lot. And they come. I'll also start controversially because I want to compete with you, Shiva. I love the term greenwashing. I love it because it indicates that somebody somewhere thinks it's important enough to lie about. And at a certain stage, 5 years ago, there would be no such thing as a climate or environmental transition plan. Now, when we issued a report a month ago about the low number that have and which criteria they do and they don't have, that caused waves. That is an impact that you have, and that's not just caused waves in our community, but rather investors start looking at it. They request specific indicators. They want to see which companies are those that had many of the credible transition plan and so on. The reason I started with greenwashing is because you're always going to start with bad plans. I have no idea how good Philip Morris is, and I'm not going to go into that particular discussion. But if we come to the world from a place of, look, we all started here, we all use energy, we all have, or most of us have flown, have at certain stages in our life eaten meat and so on and so forth, and we want to get to a point of zero. The way companies are looking at it now, and financial institutions, to mention the bank, but GFANs or all of the other net zero financial initiatives, they have a massive impact. Our requesters go into the many tens of trillion, 138, I always forget the number, $1 trillion. Investors request information via CDP, and we do not provide information about things outside of the E at this stage. So I think that in itself is impact.
It's fascinating. And Andrea, if you could give an example from your own experience of how you're leveraging the data you collect with a positive impact.
There are plenty of examples. We are not directly involved in many of them, but I can give you an example that has been recently developed in Brazil, where, as you may know, the new government is very much committing in the preservation of the rainforest, the Amazonian rainforest, of course. And therefore, there is a project that has been launched that is making use of satellite data and other data that are generated in place to verify what is the carbon cycle of the Amazon forest, to be sure that deforestation and the forest degradation stops. And this is a kind of monitoring that is having very much of an effect over there, and it is governmental-led.
And Marlene, can you share examples? Because I suppose you're seeing how customers are taking their data from the system and then applying that.
Yeah. I've got so many actually, but I probably want to share one that we've been through ourselves as OneTrust, because obviously we use our own systems, we go through the same exercise as every other company as well. And I interview loads of people for the company. I'm quite involved in getting new talent into the organisation. And in the last probably 2 years, I've noticed people start asking us about our own ESG program. How do we empower women in the organisation? How do we offset all the travel that we do? And in all honesty, we didn't know. We didn't have that data to start with. And people started asking for it. And we had people turning us down as a company, saying, oh, if you don't know this, we don't want to work for you. And but we changed a lot as a company. We started looking at these things, collecting these things, and reporting on them, and being very transparent about them. And just the impact on how I can now answer these questions and how I can talk about my own company, and just to see how that impacts our workforce, people that we interview. It's great to see, and just to see that people make this a criteria, and just that pressure it puts on companies. I find that really, really exciting to see. So,
yeah. I wonder how PMI is using that to attract talent. I feel we've kind of touched on a couple of controversial points, and I want to finish with one that I've read about a couple of times, that some are predicting that this term ESG is going to fall out of use and be replaced by something else. And Shiva, what's your view on this? Do you think we're going to change? We talked about CSR, that's kind of disappeared a little bit. ESG, are we going to be calling it something else in a few years' time?
It's hard to say, but I'd say yes, the term has baggage, but it also has tremendous name recognition. So it's good and bad in that sense, right? So, I don't see it going away. I know it has baggage. It'll probably get refined. It'll be ESG with an asterisk saying, what do you exactly mean, right?
Asterisks. If you don't, you'll have the bounty hunters after you if you end up greenwashing using the data. I think that's a great point to end the discussion on. Thank you very much for participating in the panel session.